Hey, everybody. Welcome to session 257 of the Behavioral Observations podcast. In today's episode, I'm thrilled to be joined by none other than Dr. Tim Vollmer. In this episode, we talk about a wide variety of research and practice topics, as well as some funny stories from his long and prolific career. Specifically, we talk about how his dog ate his copy of Strategies and Tactics, how he and his colleagues analyzed 2- and 3-point shot patterns in basketball games, his line of research that examined the good behavior game, behavior analysis in the game of poker, and his take on why he and his students have such an affinity for one another. That's not all. We probably spent the most amount of time discussing the topic of ignoring in the context of behavioral intervention plans and its potential problems. And I really hope you stick around to the end of the podcast because we close the show in a slightly different format. Instead of asking Tim my normal closing question, which of course is what advice do you have for the newly minted BCBA, I ask him to share his thoughts on the future direction of behavior analysis, including both the risks to our field and some potential opportunities. I think you'll find that really insightful. So this is an episode I really hope you listen through all the way to the end. And also, I hope it's one that you share with friends and colleagues. Before we get to the episode itself, I want to let you know that we are brought to you today by thebehavioraltoolbox.com. You've probably heard me talk about this before. Thebehavioraltoolbox.com is a new education and training site that my colleagues Anika Costa and Dr. Polly Gavoni and I have been working on for over 2 years. If you're a behavior analyst working in public schools, please check out our first course, Ready, Set, Consult. Our second course, When Not to FBA, 5 Strategies to Implement Before Conducting a Functional Assessment, will also be out soon, and more trainings are on the way. We're also brought to you by HRIC Recruiting. If you're looking for a job, if you're moving, if you're about to graduate, or if you're just curious if the grass really is greener on the other side, contact Barbara Voss at hricolorado.com and schedule a confidential chat right away. Nobody knows the employment scene in our field better than Barb. So again, go to hricolorado.com and schedule a time to chat. Last but not least, if you are looking for CEUs, you can get CEUs by listening to some of your favorite guests here on the Behavioral Observations podcast. That's right. Go to behavioralobservations.com and go to the Get CEUs page and see what we have to offer. We have almost 50 events for you. So there's a lot to choose from across all variety of topics and with some of your favorite behavioral observations guests. So that's it for opening remarks. I really hope you enjoy this conversation as much as I did. So please enjoy my discussion here with none other than Dr. Tim Vollmer.
Welcome to the Behavioral Observations Podcast, stimulating talk for today's behavior analysts. Now here's your host, Matt Sikoria.
Dr. Tim Vollmer, welcome to the Behavioral Observations Podcast. How are you doing this morning?
Doing well. How are you?
I'm great. This has been, at least in my mind, a long time coming. I've been wanting to get you on for quite some time. We were just chatting before I hit the record button that we've kind of passed in hallways and other settings at conferences and things like that. But this is the first time we actually had a chance to chat. So I'm grateful for the opportunity. And I'm also certainly grateful of the huge body of research you've put together over your career. And I've selected some topics from that body of work and other topics as well that I think will be fun to get into. But before we do that, I'm really curious what the behavior analytics scene was like when you discovered it. So how did you come in contact with behavior analysis? Was it more out of the realm of experimental psychology at the time or clinical psychology? What was the scene like at the time? And also, what made you want to pursue it as a profession, career, lifestyle, whatever you want to call it?
Right. Yeah, I think it depends on kind of how far you go back, but there was something even in my early adolescence that kind of attracted me to psychology. So I would read, magazines like Psychology Today, and then one of my neighbors, an older girl, was in a psychology class in high school, and you had to wait until I think your junior year to take that. And I couldn't wait to take it, but I used to look at her book on the school bus and the things like that. And in that class, the psychology teacher, who was also our music teacher, assigned one of Skinner's books. I think it was Beyond Freedom and Dignity. And I actually read that in high school. Now, keep in mind that it was a book that was kind of in the popular press at the time, and was causing kind of a stir. So I read it and found it really interesting to the extent I could understand it at that point in my life, and talked more with that psychology teacher. And he told me about Western Michigan University because I grew up in Michigan. And of course, Western Michigan is well known, and was even at that time, for behavioral psychology. And so I sort of wanted to disappoint my father and sister, who were Michigan State people, and move out of my backyard. And so I went to Kalamazoo for a couple of years and took all the classes there, had many great instructors and professors, Jack Michael, Bruce Hesse, Barb Fulton, and really kind of, I think, took about all the classes that I could when I was there. And our behavior analysis was really kind of hot at the University of Florida at the time, with Johnston and Pennypacker having come out, and Mark Branch was here, and Malagodi. And so I did my last couple of undergraduate years here at the University of Florida, and just being around all of those people at Western and then at University of Florida really kind of locked me in and kept me interested in on a philosophical level and the level of application.
I see. So you finished your undergrad at UF, and obviously you went to graduate school. So how did your academic career unfold from there?
Well, I finished my undergraduate years and then worked for a couple of years, and when I met my wife, and she was in graduate school in speech language pathology, and I had applied to the University of Florida, but it was right at the time that Jim Johnston was moving over to Auburn from the University of Florida. And so there wasn't really a good fit at that time with me. And then Brian Iwata moved into Florida, I guess, to replace Johnston's line. And I took post-bac classes with Brian, seminars, and some other ones with Mark Branch and other people, and then formally applied to the program along with several other programs around the country, and decided to stay at UF. Of course, Brian was doing very exciting work at the time. It was shortly after publication of his seminal 1982 paper, and I got in at the right time. Was able to do a lot of the early treatment research that my students envy now, because it was so great just doing studies on things like DRA and DRO, and uh, those things are a little bit more complicated these days, but that's how I got involved.
Sounds like probably one of the most exciting eras in the history of the field to be around. So was Brian your graduate advisor or major professor? I don't know what you guys called it at the time, but
Yes. So I applied to work with him. Actually, it's quite an interesting story. I think I recently told part of it in his eulogy when he so unfortunately passed away recently. But when I had applied for a post-bac status in order to take some of the graduate seminars, I needed an advisor. And Mark Branch had told me, well, it sounds like your interests are more aligned with the applied side of things. And so Iwata's coming, and, it would be most appropriate for him to serve as your post-bac advisor. So I don't even know how. I somehow got a hold of him because it was before the days of internet and cell phones, but somehow we connected and I figured out where he was living. He was staying in an apartment at the time with his wife, Peg, and his two young daughters at that time as they were building a house. They were waiting for their house to be built. And so Brian and I literally sat on boxes talking. And, one of the last conversations he and I had, he said, it's interesting how it worked out. We worked together for over 3 decades, but didn't know each other. And we just took a chance on each other at that time. And he agreed to do the 1 year supervision. And I did well in his graduate seminar. You better believe I made sure I did well. And then it became an option when I actually applied. He accepted me. And one of the things that he said is, you have to help me build the lab. And as a 22-year-old or whatever I was at the time, I didn't know what that meant. I thought I would be like hammering nails and building some kind of large operant chamber or something. But I, of course, agreed to it. But what he meant was more lab in the metaphorical sense. And so I did help him from ground up, starting his self-injurious behavior demonstration project here in Florida. And that's where a lot of us did some of our early work in that lab. Jennifer Zarconi, Rick Smith, Dorothy Lehrman, Bridget Shore, Jody Maslowski, and many others.
That is a sitting on the boxes story is great. It's those little moments that I think it's hard for people who have read his work over the years in a professional context to sometimes, if you don't get to know someone personally, you don't get those little fun little anecdotes that humanize people beyond the printed page or the conference presentation. So I appreciate you sharing that. And throughout this conversation, if there are other stories that come to mind, that would be feel free to share those. And I'll just point out for the listener, in the winter issue of the 2024 JABA, there's a whole series of memoriams for not only Dr. Iwata, but Dr. Hank Pennypacker, who also passed in a more sudden way, I believe. And I'm wondering also, from what I understand, I never met Hank. I call him Hank as if I knew him, but I just know I feel like I know him through osmosis, because being one of Jim Johnson's students and knowing a bunch of people that Hank has influenced, I feel like I've gotten to know him vicariously, certainly through pouring through the second edition of Johnson and Pennypacker as a graduate student at Auburn, which was only slightly slimmer than the first edition. But anyway, all that to say, I think anyone who has met him has attested to him being a very colorful character. And I'm wondering if there are some thoughts, stories, or comments, anecdotes, etc., that you might want to share with the audience about Hank.
Oh, there are so many.
I bet.
He was still teaching when I came back to Florida, and I was very fortunate to take his strategies and tactics seminar. So we read the first edition of his book in class, and he would have us come every week with two questions that he would read, and we would discuss as a group. And I had a dog at the time who would eat up just about anything. He ate up several of my novels, and he chewed up the cover of Strategies and Tactics. And I remember I came with a homemade sort of like manila envelope folder version of the book because the cover had been chewed. And I said, "You're not going to believe this, Dr. Pennypacker, but my dog ate it." And he said, "Well, the question is, did he digest it or did he spit it back up?" So, and then he and I became friends. When I moved back to Florida in '98, we played golf every Wednesday morning at the crack of dawn. Hank was the first to admit he wasn't a very good golfer, but he loved looking at his data, and he would show me his data all the time, and chart what was at first his progress, and then as he aged, he was fascinated by the loss of skill, and he would chart his chipping and his scores and his putting and everything. And we had some great times out on the golf course, but mostly I just viewed him as a friend and mentor. He was always so kind and helpful and incredibly intelligent in so many ways. And the loss of both he and Brian in within a few weeks of each other was just almost unfathomable for me and for many of my students and colleagues here at the University of Florida. So those were big losses. Yeah, it's been a rough few months for us.
Well, again, I appreciate you personalizing both of these giants in our field with those kind of touching stories. And again, just as a reminder for listeners, please check out the winter issue of JABA. There's just, again, a lot of moving tributes. And so what I would like to do, though, is, get in, as we said earlier, I want to get into your, some of the things that you're, I think you're well known for, things like alternatives to extinction and, meditations on the word ignore. And we'll get into that in a second. But I want to pick up an interesting study that you and Jason Beret did in 2013, where you discussed the relationship relationship between the matching law and 3-point shots in college basketball. So this is one that always kind of stands out in my memory every time I see it cited somewhere. I was like, oh yeah, I remember that one. So I'm curious, what was the thought process? What was the motivation how did you decide to study this? And what did you learn as a result?
Okay. Well, I think it was much earlier than 2013. I don't remember the exact year, but I think you said 2013, but it was early 2000s, if I remember.
Okay. I'll go back and run the exact reference down for the show notes.
Yeah. So I think that, well, the reason I remember the time period was for two reasons. One is I started thinking about it when I was at the University of Pennsylvania, and my close colleague and friend Joe Lally and I used to go walking at lunch around the Penn track, which is famous for the Penn relays and sporting events. But so it was always kind of a thrill to be walking around the tracks, but also being with Joe, who was such another great historical figure in our field. And we'd talk about sports, and we'd talk about behavior analysis and the blending of the two and everything. And I like looking at sports statistics, and I started noticing in the box scores of sporting events, of basketball events, that whether it was whether it was college or NBA, it seemed that the level or the number of shots that guys were taking from the 3-point range would sort of roughly match their success, if you will, at taking those shots. And that, combined with kind of an early lecture that I had been giving in various classes for years, I kind of like to think that I was thinking ahead about the notion of data analytics and how much behavior analysis really has to offer and should have to offer for sports analytics. And so those kind of combined interests with sports and the matching law, and believing that behavior analysis could contribute a lot to sports analytics, led me to have that interest. And then when I moved to the University of Florida, an undergraduate student who was working in Tim Hackenberg's lab decided that he wanted to get some applied experience. And that student was Jason Beret, who has of course, gone on to have an illustrious career at the New England Center for Children. And Jason's brilliant, and quantitatively, there are very few who match his skills. And so I had this undergraduate in my office thinking that I was going to have to explain the matching law to him and the various calculations. And I couldn't even finish a sentence. And he was saying, yeah, I got it. Okay, yeah. And I kind of had this thing where if I asked a student to do something, the expectation was by the next lab meeting, they would have that done, unless it was like, a super big project or something. Well, the very next day, Jason showed up at my office with all the calculations for the men's team at the University of Florida. And then he said, I can do the women's team by next week. And then he did. And so that's how that study came into being. And we just thought it was a neat demonstration of sports analytics and behavior analysis. So we decided to publish it.
Very cool. I don't know a ton about basketball, to be perfectly candid. I only have room for one professional sport in my mind, and that's the NFL. But my sons love basketball and play high school basketball, so I've been kind of dragged along this journey a little bit. So I was thinking about, I was actually at one of my son's basketball games last night, and it's my understanding that the trends in the NBA, there was a shift in kind of overall strategy towards taking more 3-point shots than perhaps would have been attempted a few decades ago. And I remember hearing a podcast with Chris Bosh, and he was explaining that transition, and he was in the league at that time during that kind of transitory time from kind of the old school way of playing to this, to people just, nailing threes from the line, from the line. So
yeah,
it's kind of interesting in the evolution of the sport. I guess one other aspect of the sports analytics that I think is noteworthy too is that, I'm not sure if you're familiar. There's a guy, he's been on the podcast before. His name is Brett Yaris. He's been using behavior analysis, in particular the standard acceleration chart, to look at various metrics in professional football, and he's developed a whole site and things like that about and he calls games and things like that. And he's apparently, these analytics give him tremendous insight, and he's had some good success with doing that. So there seems to be, I guess my point of bringing that up, there seems to be a lot of potential there for those who are interested in marrying those two topics.
Regardless of your title, you're a behavior consultant who is working in or with schools, and you are struggling and wondering why your interventions are not producing the desired results. You are not alone. Unfortunately, those tasked with improving behavior in schools are too often left to carry the burden by themselves. You are the behavior person, so you take care of it, is the unsaid mantra. But you can't improve behavior and the associated outcomes by yourself. In fact, creating sustainable improvement in student behavior almost always requires changes in the performance of the educators. I'm Dr. Pauly, and along with my colleagues Anika Costa and Matt Sikoria, we are designing coursework called the Behavioral Toolbox. In it, you will be taught strategies grounded in organizational behavior management for consulting in schools in a way that brings out the best in educators so they can bring out the best in the students they serve. If this sounds exciting, be sure to click on the link in the description to sign up for more information.
All right. So one of the things, again, I want to get to the extinction piece. And so I guess now is a good time as any. And maybe we'll start with this. I know there's a paper that you're involved with. The primary author is Lindsay, I want to say Laveras. I'm hoping I'm pronouncing that correctly.
Yeah, she uses more of a Spanish pronunciation, Lluveras, but
okay.
I know her mainly as Lindsay Loveras. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you for the pronunciation correction on that. With a name like mine, I try to get the pronunciations correct. But the title of the paper is Recommendations Regarding the Use of the Term Ignore in Applied Behavior Analysis. So I want to kind of dig into this paper, and then maybe we can get into some of the more granular aspects of your work in this area more broadly. But, I guess perhaps to ask the question in a more Seinfeldian way, like, what's the deal with ignore? Or what's the problem with using the word ignore particularly in the use of behavior plans and things like that?
Well, I think there are a number of potential problems. And as a result, for many years, I've recommended anyone working with me or really any behavior analyst that I know to try to strike such usage from their behavior intervention plans. One is legal risk, and relatedly, risk to the client. So lay people tend to read the word ignore as quite literally ignore, like act as if it didn't happen, when in fact, what behavior analysts really mean is don't provide a certain type of attention when that behavior occurs, but we're not ignoring it. We're attending to the fact that it happened very acutely. And so this has been misconstrued in some legal cases and ones that I've been directly aware of. I won't go into the details of those, but just the fact that the word ignore was used in the behavior intervention plan resulted in someone like a teacher, for example, saying, well, it says right here in the written plan, ignore. And so I did, and then the other student got hurt. And so this is a professional behavior analyst telling that teacher to ignore the behavior. And so I think that's one problem, or at least potential problem. Another is that there are just some forms of behavior that are too dangerous to ignore, basically impossible to ignore, because someone, as in that example, could get hurt, or the person themselves might get hurt if it's self-injurious behavior. So oftentimes the recommendation is not appropriate in that respect. At other times, attention doesn't serve any real function at all. And so the time expenditure teaching people like parents to ignore or even to minimize their attention for that matter might be functionally moot. And so people are spending a lot of time and then getting very concerned when someone's attending to the behavior, but that's not what is maintaining the behavior. So in those cases, it's more of a practical issue to and allocation of resources and time that matters more. And in some cases, some sort of attention might actually serve a form of discriminative control, or might have other effects on the behavior, such as actually reminding someone, like, that's not appropriate for this situation. So we don't want to, across the board, speaking of Hank, I can think of a specific example when my son was very small and we were out playing golf with Hank. And this is about the time when the Tiger Woods commercial of him bouncing the golf ball on his golf club was very popular. And my son, while Hank was lining up his putt, was bouncing the ball on his putter. And I said, Theodore, stop. And he did. And I thought to myself, like, I'm going around telling all these parents to don't say, son, stop doing that. And I just told him to stop. And he did. And later I was able to explain to him that distracts people when they're trying to concentrate. And he never did it again. So at times, providing some kind of attention or feedback is a good thing to do. It's helpful to someone and their understanding. So there are a lot of sort of messy reasons that are messy outcomes when using the term ignore, sometimes just misunderstandings, but I find it better to describe, and this is what we talked about in the paper, is to more specifically describe exactly what people are supposed to do, because it's not ignore. Usually there's something they're supposed to do in response to the behavior, and giving that explicit instruction in writing and through behavioral skills training is more effective.
Are you looking for a new job, but you're overwhelmed with all the emails that you're getting from various ABA agencies? What if there was someone who was in your corner and could help you find the perfect job placement? Well, that person exists. Barbara Voss has been working as a recruiter for over 30 years, and her company, HRIC, specializes in placing BCBAs in permanent full-time positions throughout the United States. Barbara has been placing BCBAs since 2011, so she knows our business, and she offers personalized service to any BCBA looking for a new position. She also helps companies looking to hire BCBAs too. Here are just some of the things Barbara can help you with. She can provide information about salary ranges in different markets across the country. She can help you write your resume. She can coordinate and prepare you for the interview process, and even help negotiate the right salary for you. And best of all, there are no charges to any candidate for all of these services. When you're ready to make a change and want to work with someone who will listen to you and understand what you need in a new position, contact Barbara at HRIC. To schedule a confidential discussion, head over to hricolorado.com. Again, that's hricolorado.com, and hit the contact button to connect with Barbara. You won't be disappointed. Yeah, are there general, aside from, don't use the word ignore, strike that from your professional vocabulary, are there some other general themes or things that you've learned along the way that would be helpful to impart to the audience in this body of work? There's a lot of discussion in the, social media or, kind of and elsewhere about the use of extinction, whether we should be using it and things like that. And, as of late, I've really been a big fan of the term under what conditions, and so, under what conditions, what are the conditions under which extinction, could be helpful, and certainly where are the ways in which we can kind of maybe pare that back if it's either A, unhelpful, or B, causes some sort of distress in the people we're trying to help.
Yes. Yeah, I think you hit it on the head there, that so much of our decision making and behavior analysis should depend on context, and certainly the decisions about extinction are represented in that. There are numerous times when extinction simply cannot be implemented or should not be implemented, such as in a case of severe self-injury, let's say in a school setting, and a student is banging their head against a concrete block or something like that. And we know that the behavior, let's say, is maintained by attention. If we place that behavior on extinction, we're not trained as behavior analysts to make a judgment about the effect of any single blow on that individual's brain or retina or other parts of their head. That would require medical collaboration and medical supervision. So we should not be making recommendations under those circumstances about withholding attention in the case of severe self-injury like that. Another issue is that so many of our interventions within the literature in behavior analysis are interventions that are conducted with perfect integrity. That is, trained professional therapists are reinforcing some alternative response, such as communication, on a very strict schedule, and then explicitly not reinforcing the target behavior, which might be some dangerous behavior. Well, as soon as we translate that intervention away from the tightly controlled context in which many studies are conducted, we have to recognize that very seasoned, well-trained behavior analysts will make mistakes. I've made mistakes demonstrating procedures to parents, to my graduate students, to my undergraduate students, and I've been doing this for 40 years. Uh, my graduate students make mistakes. Our board certified behavior analysts make mistakes. So if we make mistakes, certainly parents are going to make mistakes. Teachers are going to make mistakes. Grandparents are going to make mistakes. You could go down the line where family members, next door neighbors, friends, cousins, somebody's going to occasionally reinforce the behavior. So it's not truly an extinction schedule, it's an intermittent schedule of reinforcement. So we have to be able to design treatments that would be robust enough to work in the face of intermittent reinforcement of the dangerous behavior. I'm glad that you brought up the notion of contextualizing, because in the last few years I've had the great learning experience of working side by side with Vivian Ibanez, who is a former student of Kathleen Piazza and has really dedicated her clinical energies toward pediatric feeding disorders. And this is one of the areas that has been somewhat controversial about whether escape extinction should be used. And what I'm seeing in her data is that, first of all, it's not extinction of the sort that I think people kind of envision, where something really dangerous or forceful happens when the mealtime refusal occurs. It's a non-removal of the spoon. And the other kind of surprising thing about it is very quickly the children start accepting bites. And any behavior like crying or anything like that is very short-lived. And then also very quickly, many of the children start seemingly enjoying the food. In other words, the stimulus function of the food changes from being aversive due to some history with usually a medical problem or something like that, to being reinforcing once they encounter that stimulus without the serious health sequelae. So critical in that phrasing is without the medical health sequelae, and that is that Vivian and colleagues doing similar work are very careful about the ethical requirement to evaluate medical contributing variables. So all of the children who receive that type of treatment have already been treated for whatever the root cause of the problem is, such as reflux or constipation or swallowing difficulties. And there are many, many more. Those are addressed first. And then it's the residual conditioned aversion to food that is left that is then treated through that procedure. So that is one where I believe the research shows that that is a very effective procedure. We're starting to see indices of happiness. Some of Kate Peterson's group has measured indices of happiness during those procedures. We're doing that now here and showing that pretty quickly the mealtime becomes a joyous occasion for not only the child, but for their family members. So, yeah, I think you have to kind of take a step back and say, under what circumstances are we talking about extinction? What are the effects, the individual? What are the effects on their family and others in their environment? So it's not, there's never going to be a black and white about that. It's like all perplexing ethical dilemmas that we face as professionals, various gray areas that we need to work out. And we don't operate, and I hope no behavior analysts operate as a lone ranger. We should be implementing peer review among our colleagues and peers, and getting advice and sharing our data and our procedures openly to make sure that we're all doing the most ethical things under the circumstances in which we're operating.
So if I understand you, excuse me, if I understand you correctly, Tim, it sounds like there's a risk analysis in that specific example, and the risk benefit, if you will, and the benefit of overcoming that feeding challenge outweighs whatever the cons are of using that particular procedure, because it's over. Those barriers seem to be overcome quite rapidly, and it turns this negative experience into one that's quite positive very quickly. Whereas I can imagine perhaps a less direct type of treatment might take, much, much longer. And all the while that individual still has that feeding problem that has other health consequences, I would imagine.
Yeah,
I don't mean putting words in your mouth, but
no,
I'm
no,
just trying to imagining the
right.
reasoning.
You are right. And also, there are a lot of things about, for example, child consent and assent that are contextual as well. The academies of pediatricians are wrestling with the same sorts of issues. For example, if a child needs a type of surgery, let's say a heart surgery, the child is probably going to resist if given the choice to have the surgery. But the child's parents and the child's physicians are the ones who are responsible for making the decisions about the child's long-term well-being. And similarly with something like feeding, that those decisions have to be made. And even scaling down to something that might seem relatively innocuous, like oral hygiene, where a child, particularly children with autism and intellectual disabilities, sometimes have a sensitivity about having something presented to their mouth or in their mouth. But what we've seen is many youngsters develop significant tooth decay and gum disease, which then results in more serious health problems and or even self-injurious behavior. So sometimes decisions about the long-term interests of the individual have to be taken into account in deciding which treatments to use. Now, with that said, I think it is an important scientific aim of the clinical application of behavior analysis to identify procedures that do not rely upon extinction. And so I know Vivian and many of her feeding colleagues around the country are working on developing procedures that do not involve extinction. And I am a big fan of that work and trying to do that. And similarly with healthcare routines like oral hygiene or blood draws or receiving vaccinations, things like that, working on procedures from a standpoint of desensitization and the use of positive reinforcement are certainly goals and aims for the field, so that we can avoid some of the negative side effects of using extinction.
Hey everyone, as a BCBA, meeting your continuing ed needs can be challenging at times. That's why I have made selected episodes of the Behavioral Observations podcast available for Type 2 continuing education credits. That's right. You can meet a portion of your professional development requirements on the go. Currently, we have CEs for topics including functional assessment, ethics, and supervision. Come learn from podcast favorites such as Greg Hanley, Pat Fryman, Mark Dixon, as well as many other amazing guests. For more information, head on over to behavioralobservations.com/getCEs. So in addition to your work in this particular area, one of the things so I'll let the audience in on a little secret. I've had a chance to talk with some of your former students who've fed me some topics
Okay.
and questions, etc. One of them was wanted to talk about, or at least wanted to give you the opportunity to talk about some of the topics that you've done research in, or at least supported other students with, that are beyond the DRA, FCT extinction, etc. And I'm thinking of things like basic research with rats, human operant research, the education-based research. I had Jeannie Donaldson on the show about a year or two ago, and talking about your work and her work in the area of the good behavior game, work in the foster care systems, and things like that. So you've had kind of very diverse interests, I suppose, and I'm just kind of curious, how do you go about choosing things to prioritize in your research program?
Oh, that's a good question. A lot of times there are certain particular situations that arise that are kind of unexpected. So I'll try to remember all the different areas that you said, and I'm not sure if you want me to touch on all of them, but I can.
Just a sample. I'm just kind of curious, like, how do these things come on your radar screen? And is
Yeah.
it the Skinnerian drop everything and study it type of ethos, or what? I'm just
Not quite. It's almost always been some unexpected turn of events led to it. So, for example, the work with rats was done with Franz von Herren originally, who had a rat lab at the University of Florida when John Barrero and I first arrived. John Barrero was my first student, and we were doing a lot of work on differential reinforcement schedules, fixed time and variable time schedules. And so we talked with Franz about doing sort of a translational model, and we were able to get some funding to do that work. And it was a way to kind of set up a translational model. Some of the other things, Jeannie probably mentioned that we were involved in a consulting project in another state, and the ask one part of what they were asking was some ideas for classroom management procedures for kindergarten classrooms. They were trying to ensure that children were not being placed in special education due to disruptive behavior in the classroom. And by coincidence, on the flight there to the other state, I was reading good behavior game articles that I had assigned to one of my undergraduate classes. And I thought, well, this seems to work. And I arrived and started looking on the internet, and dozens of papers showing the effects of the good behavior game started popping up. And so, although that first study with Jeannie was kindergartners, and to our knowledge, nothing had been done with kids that quite that young yet. I proposed it to them, and they accepted the idea. And so I started bringing Jeannie with me to this other state, and she was responsible for the implementation of the good behavior game, and it was wildly effective. And teachers started wanting to join on as co-trainers and things like that. So that was very situational how that got started. And then other students knew that we were doing that work, and they became attracted to it, like Ray Jocelyn, for example. So it's those kind of arose from different circumstances. The child welfare work was, we were approached at the University of Florida by Mike Stoutamore and Michael Hemingway, both of whom have unfortunately passed away now, but they approached us about supervising the northern half of Florida with a parent training project, and the southern half of Florida would be supervised by the University of South Florida with Glenn Dunlap and Rusty Clark, mainly being the university connections there. And the more I thought about it, the more interesting it seemed to be, sort of a different population and a way to get my students involved in some of that work. And so uh, we agreed to join on and continued in some capacity for about 10 years working with the state of Florida on that project. So again, kind of a situational event that occurred.
I see. I guess I have a couple of follow-up questions to that answer, and I guess one, I'll take them. I guess I'll do them in reverse order. This is more of a comment than anything than a question, I suppose. But it seems like in the child welfare space, if you will, or that and Pat Fryman's terms, the area under the curve is massive compared to what we as behavior analysts, in the populations we typically serve. So it seems to be a huge area that is probably screaming for more practitioners and better technologies and things like that. I'm aware of other places like the state of Alabama through Auburn University and other institutions are doing good work in that area as well. But just seems like a huge growth opportunity and a huge population that is so in need of services for sure.
Yeah.
The second, question related, going back to the good behavior game for a minute, is I'm a massive fan of the good behavior game, and I'm just curious. I asked Jeannie this question, and I don't know if there's a good answer for it, but I'm just curious if you have any insight as to why that hasn't perhaps punctured, if you will, the educational zeitgeist. I'm thinking, I know that's a 25-cent word. I'm just trying to think of a better way to, why isn't that common practice? Why doesn't every teacher know about it? My day job is that of a school consultant, and most of the stuff I do, these days I'm trying to do fewer FBAs and fewer behavior support plans because I'm looking at the overall milieu in which these referrals come my way. And I'm like, we're going to get way better outcomes if we do some of these, kind of tier 2 and tier 3 type of interventions. And my go-to is the good behavior game. And there hasn't been a teacher I've worked with that's ever heard of it before. And, and also there's a whole other aspect of, kind of resistance to it and things like that. That's perhaps a whole another podcast, but I'm just curious more the general point. Do you have a sense as to why the good behavior game is not more widely known in educational circles than it might be? Or is it maybe I'm just in a little pocket in New Hampshire and Vermont that's cut off from cut off from all the other people who already know about this? So if that's the case, correct me if I'm wrong.
No, I find the same thing every time there's some renewed interest in it within my group and someone takes it on. So, Jeannie's work and then Ray Jocelyn's work, it's always kind of a surprise to the teachers and the school administrators. You would think that it's something that, because of its effectiveness, would spread like wildfire. But I think, within educational systems, a lot of times there's some quibbling about nuances of procedures and terminology associated with procedures. And one of the things that we learned really quickly was that good behavior game as a name isn't going to fly with like high school students, but the procedure works really well with high school students. Ray Jocelyn has shown that very clearly over the years. So he calls it different things, and that might have something to do with it. A lot of, a lot of procedures that end up being popularized in schools are well packaged procedures, like where there's a specific internet site, and I know there are some for good behavior game, but those types of ideas kind of come in waves where a school district will buy into a particular idea and then it kind of goes out of vogue and back in. And I don't think there's been any, particular ambassadors. I know Dennis Embry has been one over the years for a good behavior game, but but not something tangible where all schools can kind of reach out and find that particular thing. I can't really say for sure, but I will say that in my entire career, I've now seen two procedures that I consider to be almost like magic, in the sense that it's almost perfect with the success rate. One is the pediatric feeding interventions, and the other is the good behavior game. We're nowhere near that close with behavioral interventions for severe self-injury or severe aggression, in part because I think there's a lot of other things going on with those particular forms of behavior that we're not yet in touch with. But those two procedures surprise me in the way that you're describing. I would think that every medical school on every campus, everywhere across the country would have the pediatric feeding interventions in place. The parents in our community are clamoring for it. And similarly, I would think every school district would want something like that in place, but they're not. And I don't know if it's advertising, promotion, whatever you might say, terminology might
Yeah,
turn.
you are right though. Those outcome data are, it's, I sometimes refer to these if I'm doing training, like these are, sometimes what I refer to as light switch interventions, and I would look at some of like Bill Hewer's work in whole group responding in a similar way, that 1996 paper, where it's just clear functional relationships across the implementation of that response card, intervention. It's just amazing. And you mention these people, you mention these things to the people you're trying to help, and they're like, I never heard of that. It's probably, I guess you could probably say the same thing about things like, direct instruction. There's all this talk about the science of reading and this and that, and it's like, hey, we've had this figured out since the 60s. So I don't know. That's perhaps, again, another conversation for another time about dissemination. But I was just thinking about that because there's been this thread on the behavior analysis listserv about like what's behavior analysis moonshot, what major contribution. And yeah, so there's a lot of things but they're still waiting to get that, have the potential to be, that just are, haven't gotten the traction. All right, I want to change topics here a little bit. So, to a person, these unnamed people who helped me formulate some of these questions here, to a person, they said, whatever you do, ask, steer the conversation towards mentorship and supervision and things like that. They all mentioned just how much they enjoyed and were inspired by working with you. And I don't mean to, I'm not buttering you up. These are, nearly direct quotes here. I know you won an outstanding mentoring award from ABAI, and I'm told that around the University of Florida, there's these T-shirts that say, what we basically have acronyms spelling out what would Tim do or what would Tim Vollmer do and things like that. So I'd like to maybe dig into that a little bit. Do you have a specific approach to supervision? Or I guess maybe another way of thinking, what are the conditions under which all these different people who have worked with you at different points in time are saying the same thing about working with you? And again, I don't mean to this might be a little bit awkward to kind of like have you say nice things about yourself or whatever, but it was too big of a signal to ignore. So I do want to kind of get your thoughts on that.
Okay. Well, I don't think I had a plan to make that happen. I think that first I should say, the greatest joy of my professional life is my relationship with my graduate students and former graduate students. I stay in touch with many of them long after they graduate. Frequently, people will call me for advice or send me emails, and we have exchanges. And whenever we can, we get together at regional conferences and ABAI and different things like that. So I think that part of it might be that they recognize that I truly value their friendship, for lack of a better word. And I think that the relationships have changed over time. So, for example, when I was a brand new assistant professor, Louisiana State University, I was 29 years old. And so my students, like Joel Ringdahl and Bethany Marcus and Hank Roan, were not that much younger than me. And so maybe they felt sort of like little brothers or sisters or cousins or something like that. And we kind of had that sort of relationship, but we knew how to roll up our sleeves and get the work done. And later, I feel like it's been more sort of like a academic parenting role where I have a genuine interest in seeing my students make the decisions that are the best things for their career and for their families and for their own goals. And I do not find it reinforcing in any way to try to steer a student in a direction that I am interested in. I really genuinely want to find out what their goals are. And for some, their goals relate more to something other than behavior analysis. But I would like to, I'd like to encourage them. So I believe that people pick up on that and realize that what is reinforcing for me is to see their success for what their goals are. I don't know how that repertoire emerged for me. I don't know why that's reinforcing for me, but it is. And so it drives a lot of my behavior. I like to really get involved in trying to help people make decisions and make sure that they are weighing the things that will lead them to happiness and success in the future. I'm also somewhat conflict averse. I don't like when our field is in conflict, for example, members of our field. I don't like when members of the lab are in conflict. I don't like to be perceived as in conflict with my students. So my tendency is, if there is that sensation in any way, to try to work things out and do what it takes to maintain a good working professional relationship and a friendly relationship. And by that, I believe that people we work with can be our friends. I don't think it's necessarily a problem when someone views students or other colleagues as friends, because they're the people we work with. And there's a line where we know we can't cross, but we can be friendly with people and care about them and know about their families and know about their roots. And I believe people probably pick up on that in our professional relationships.
Great. I appreciate you sharing that. I just got a few more questions for you, Tim. One is, so again, my sources tell me that you've got a lot of diverse hobbies. You've talked about golf already. The poker came up in some of these, and this correspondences that I've had with some of these folks. Have you used behavior analysis as a kind of a tool to derive more enjoyment out of some of these hobbies? I'm just curious.
I think so. Like, probably my biggest hobby is reading, or my biggest outside of work hobby is reading. And I write down all the books I read and go back over them. And, so it's kind of a data collection system on my hobby, which I've had friends say, that takes all the fun out of it. Why are you doing it? Well, I like seeing, how many books I read and going back to look at them. And yes, I love poker. I would like to become more of a tournament poker player. I don't have much of a history playing tournaments. I play what they call cash games, which is just where you show up at a poker room and join a game and play against the other players. I definitely believe that my behavior analytic background plays a role in that. There's certain strategies we probably don't have enough time to get into right now, but that from a behavior analytic standpoint would kind of, or excuse me, from a poker playing standpoint would probably fly in the face of traditional beliefs, but that behavior analysts would understand readily why that might work. Just as one example is a lot of poker players say never show your hand, like always keep them guessing about whether it was a bluff or not. I disagree. I show my hand a lot because I think we want to reinforce the behavior that we want them to engage in more in the future when competing with us. So I might show it to show them that I had a really good hand intermittently to sort of keep that gamesmanship going. But so yeah, I do have a lot of hobbies. I wish I played more golf. I don't as much anymore, but I love to read. I love to play poker. I love being with my family and traveling. It's a big part of my life.
Another Fryman reference. I believe he is a poker guy or has been at times. And I think it was Pat who was telling me that you don't play the cards, you play the person. Is that true in your experience, or is that lore? I'm not a poker player, so I don't have enough personal experience to suss that out in terms of whether it's true or not. But I'm just curious what your perspective is on that.
Combination. You definitely need to know which cards are good and under what circumstances. But there are times you can go into a hand and you know if you bet it a certain way, you're probably going to win because of the way the other player is, and other circumstances, you know, you better have a really, really good hand if you're going to stay in it because of who the player is. So yeah, I think there's something to that advice for sure.
Got it. All right. Last question for you, Tim. I usually end the show by asking guests for, what's your advice for the newly minted BCBA? And certainly if you have some, we'll hear it. But I'm also cognizant of, you've been at this for a long time and you've seen trends and things like that and have lots of observations and experiences to draw on. And, maybe at the risk of asking something a bit deeper, I'm curious from your perspective, what risks do you see the field facing either right now or potential risks in the future? And, what are some things we might consider as a practice to mitigate those risks?
Yeah, that is a really challenging question. For the entirety of the time I've been involved in the field, there have been some internal conflicts. So, for example, somebody might view one procedure as being superior to another procedure, and they'd kind of go at it maybe a little bit at a conference or something like that, and then people would talk about it for a little while.
I've borne witness to those things a few times, but yeah, go ahead.
So, but and this is going to sound like the gray-haired person that I am, but with the internet and social media now, it's everything's been magnified and prolonged with various discussions, and it's not as easy to go have the cup of coffee or the beer after the conference talk and realize that your similarities are probably greater than your differences. So I have a fear that different sort of like factions might emerge within the field or are emerging, and without really recognizing that our commonalities are so much greater than those differences, that I wish there could be more open discussion and friendships formed with groups that are kind of viewed or sort of viewed as divergent in their views of procedures and that sort of thing. it might go back to what I said earlier about being conflict averse. I don't like to see the field in conflict. I think it's okay to have differences of opinion for sure, but I like the idea of being able to sort through them in a friendly manner and figure out strategies to identify the context under which certain procedures would be more useful than others. And again, thematically, it kind of circles back to some of the things we were talking about earlier with different procedures and extinction and so on. So I, I'd like us to avoid the hard line and the viewing each other's practices as being inherently good or inherently bad, and open up more conversations either in print or at conferences or, if necessary, on social media, although I prefer more formal contexts, I guess, for that type of intellectual debate. So that's a fear that I have for the field, is that we'll split or fracture in ways that will be harmful, because we really need to express our commonalities and move forward, because we have such a powerful science. We have such a powerful body of application that we shouldn't be wasting our time drawing the attention of others to our flaws. We should call each other in to address those flaws and develop strategies. And so that's what I'm hopeful for and simultaneously worried about, I guess, with the field.
All right. That's some important points to think about and leave the audience with. Dr. Tim Vollmer, thank you so much for joining me today. This has been beyond my expectations. I'm so glad you had time to chat with me.
Thanks. I enjoyed it, Matt.
Hey there. If you're still here, I just want to thank you for listening to the entire podcast. And I really hope you enjoyed that last segment as much as I did. And while you're here, do me a favor, go over to behavioralobservations.com and just go to the contact page, shoot me a quick note, and let me know what you think about this episode. I hope you, again, enjoyed it as much as I did, and I will see you in the next session of Behavioral Observations.
Thank you for listening to the Behavioral Observations podcast with Matt Cicoria. You can find Matt's notes on this episode at www.behavioralobservations.com. We also invite you to stay connected with us on Facebook at facebook.com/behavioral observations and on Twitter at Behavior Podcast.